Welcome back to The Age of Humans, where we explore how culture shapes the world we live in. This season, we are exploring the world of languages and communication. If you don't already, follow us on Instagram at Age of Humans. This episode, we will try to find out the connection between culture and communication. It is a broad yet very simple topic, one that might make you think about differences between people, languages, and inherently cultures. I'm sure you have wondered at some point why Spanish people are so relaxed with time, whilst Germans are so strict. Why Italians gesticulate so much, while English speakers ask you several times, "What do you mean?" Well, it's okay if you haven't, because this is what we are going to hopefully find out today at the Age of Humans. So, let's get straight into it. You probably have encountered cultural differences before. They cover various beliefs, behaviors, languages, practices, and expressions considered unique to members of a specific ethnicity, race, or national origin. So basically, they make up to all the factors that define what a culture is. In 2001, UNESCO adopted the Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity, a legal instrument that recognizes cultural diversity as the, quote, common heritage of humanity, end of quote. This mentions that as a source of exchange, innovation, and creativity, cultural diversity is as necessary for humankind as biodiversity is for nature. Exchange is pretty straightforward, but innovation and creativity imply that something new is created. Now, let's think for a second about evolution. Let's quickly use the almighty Wikipedia to define it as the change in the heritable characteristics of biological populations over successive generations. And if we manage to agree that it is a positive change in the quality of life for some of us compared to 20,000 years ago, then we can hopefully agree that change is positive. So according to that, new is positive. So getting back to where we started, cultural diversity is positive. I hope I did not lose you on the way there, but I thought this is necessary to mention before we even start talking about communication as part of cultures. Moreover, as a cultural difference. So what is communication? Coming back to the one and only Wikipedia, communication is the act of conveying meanings from one entity or group to another through the use of mutually understood signs, symbols, and meaningful rules. Humans are social entities, therefore we want to create groups. Those signs, symbols, and rules were passed from one to another through evolution. So, somehow culture and communication are linked, and it is in our common interest to learn about how in order to be more creative, at least. Maybe there are more advantages, and that is exactly what we will cover in this episode, but not without the help of an expert. Today, we are joined by Dr. Tom Verghese, an internationally renowned consultant, presenter, executive, cultural coach, author, and founder of Cultural Synergies. His main expertise is in cultural intelligence. That's why I thought that he would be the best person to explain some of today's concepts. Now, I have to mention that the interview was produced during the pandemic. I was in Cardiff while Tom was in Australia. Therefore, the sound quality might not be at its best. The goal of Age of Humans is to give knowledge away no matter where you are. So I think that overall, being in different places fits into the big picture of our mission. Now, without any further ado, I will invite Tom to share with us his life story, a story that fits very well into today's theme.
So I was born and brought up in Malaysia. My parents are of Indian ethnicity. So I grew up in a very multi-ethnic country because Malaysia has got three cultures. You've got Malays, Indians, and Chinese. So we learned very young how to navigate cultural differences, right? Because that's very important in maintaining harmony in the country. I came out from Malaysia to Australia as a student many, many years ago. Gosh, nearly 40 years ago. And then I was working, but then I went back to university in the mid-90s because we had a recession here in Australia. I went back and I was doing my master's and I was looking for a topic for my thesis. And one of my friends at that time who was visiting here from the US said to me, why don't you look at this topic called cultural diversity? Because it's big in the US, it'll probably be big here in Australia. So when I started reading about it, and I read about some of the literature, and when I came across the intercultural pieces, I just found it resonated for me. Like it just made perfect sense. Growing up in Malaysia, you learned all those things. I thought, oh, this is fantastic. So hence, that was what I did my master's on. And I was very fortunate. I picked up a client at that time who was an airline who was just flying into Asia, Australian airline, and they were having some problems with Asian customers. They needed some help. So then I started putting programs together and help work with them on how to become more, how to interact, how to be hospitable to people of different cultures. So that's what started my journey in the field about now, just under 30 years ago. And then I did my dissertation, my doctorate on the link between cultural intelligence and effective global leadership.
Now, coming back to the main idea behind this episode, culture and communication, I want to touch on these factors that tell us how two cultures may be different. The research in this area, especially nowadays, has been covered by those who are interested and have money. Now, who is interested in cultural differences? Definitely business leaders, people who want to make sure that globalization is an asset and not a liability for their ever-growing corporations. Luckily for us, Tom has over 2 decades of experience working in the field of cultural intelligence, doing this in over 40 countries and working with business leaders of different backgrounds and cultures. I would personally say that Tom has seen enough to tell us what makes different cultures zing, unite, or simply put, get together. But before his tips and tricks into how to approach a new culture if you want to get the best experience, we will focus on a series of differences. Now, what makes us different? And quite frankly, are languages dividing us? Well, we will see now that they do. But the answer is so deeply rooted into humanity. Some might be surprised, while others would be like, meh, it makes sense. Firstly, we will have a look on the high and low context cultures. But before that, I will play a moment that occurred by accident while recording the interview. A moment of true cultural difference. So, to give you a bit of context, Ludas and I tend to record these interviews, and only towards the end we ask our guests to tell us more about themselves. There are a number of reasons why we do this. Given the culture, some may find it rude. Now, the first question to Tom was about something that had nothing to do with introducing him whatsoever. Still, Tom was kind enough to not only introduce himself, but to specify that this is a cultural difference. And this leads us to the debate of high and low context cultures. Thank you for covering this now.
That's okay. So that itself is a great example of cultural difference. Okay? Yep. Because if one was, so in many parts of the world, if you're listening to somebody, one of the first things we try to establish is, who are you? what's the context of what you're speaking about and how do you fit?
So now that we listened to this accidental yet silly example, let's dive into a possible explanation for it. What is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting classifications for cultures.
High context, low context communication actually was first introduced into the field of anthropology and cross-cultural communication by someone called Edward Hall, pioneering work in the 1950s. And then it was built on by Gerd Hofstadter in the 60s, Fons Trompenas, and of course, all the various other people who have come. But the distinction between high context and low context cultures, if you think of it like a binary, low context cultures are cultures where yes means yes, no means no. So in other words, it's very black and white. You say what you mean and you mean what you say. So you get straight to the point. Okay, low context. You don't have to guess. In high context cultures, yes may mean yes, or yes may mean no, or yes may mean maybe, based on the tone of the voice, the pitch, the facial expressions, the body language. So in other words, you've got to read the whole message. Right? The words are only one medium. For example, a language like Mandarin, one word can have 4 different meanings based on the tonality of the word.
And my question, I guess, would be, we have high and low context cultures, and people send messages, as you said, differently. Like it can, one thing can mean a couple or 4 things, but what would be the cultural factors that maybe historically speaking influenced the way those cultures evolved to be high and low context?
Well, so if we go back in time and think, how did cultures first evolve in the first place, right? So human beings are tribal, right? So we live in small tribes, in small groups. So go back to the days of the cave. We used to work together in small groups, and that's what protected each other. So culture evolved out of a shared understanding of meaning. So language, the purpose of language was that we could communicate to each other, right? So if we are in the same kind of group, the same culture, so you can imagine if we are hunting for buffaloes, one of the things that we would want to do is keep quiet, right? So we would then, between us, create ways of speaking and understanding that would not require words, because we came from the same language, same cultural style, same nuances, etc. But once you start changing that and going into mixing with different tribes, what we may mean one thing may not mean the same thing. So therefore, we now become we have to be more explicit. So use an example like football. Like we use the word football as an example. So you are living in Cardiff in the UK. So when we talk about football in the UK, what do we refer to?
What Americans may call soccer.
Soccer, correct. But if you were in the United States and you use the word football, it would mean gridiron, right? American rules football. If you came to Australia and the southern part of Australia,
Aussie rules.
You use football, Aussie rules. But if you were in the northern part of Australia, it would be rugby.
Whoa, okay, that one I didn't know.
Right? So just the one word has different meanings, right? So hence, if we are both, say, from the UK, or we're both, when we talk football, we know we're talking soccer. But if you're here in Melbourne talking football, it's Aussie rules. Because if you were talking soccer, you would say soccer.
Yeah.
So hence, that's how language has evolved.
Nice.
So the higher the context languages become, the high context languages are languages where we can speak between the lines, right? That you don't need to be so explicit. Whereas in low context, we tend to be far more explicit. We say it as we say. So I'll give you an example. I've been working recently with a Japanese organization here in Australia, working with them to help with the Japanese-Australian interface. And one of the questions that was asked by one of the Australian participants is actually when the Japanese leaders talk to us, they don't give us that much instructions, but we have to work out what it is. And so sometimes we're not clear, etc. And then another Japanese junior person said, oh, you just read between the lines. So you can only do that if you come from the same cultural background because you understand the signals, you understand the nuances. But if you're not, you go, well, what do they want?
There were several studies based on Hall's theory aiming to show differences between cultures, such as the low context United States in parallel to the high context China or Korea, or United States compared to Mexico, another high context culture. However, the more interesting study was done once again in a work environment to showcase differences and similarities between Russian and Romanian individuals. Grigore Pirioshka undertook this study and concluded that, quote, context is of paramount importance for best decisions. Nevertheless, even similar patterns of different cultures could be supported on unexpected different pillars, as the case study on organizational culture in Romania and Russia has proven. Therefore, market participants on organizations should know all these issues in order to embrace the best decisions and outcomes. End of quote. Needless to add here, Romanians and Russians both come from high context cultures. Okay, so now that we know that in Northern Australia the context is so high that people there call rugby football, we can move on to the next category, sequential and synchronic cultures. So basically, some cultures think of time sequentially as a linear commodity to spend, save, or waste. On the other hand, other cultures view time synchronically as a constant flow to be experienced in the moment and as a force that cannot be contained or controlled. Some examples of sequential cultures are the United States, Canada, England, Germany, the Northern European countries, Netherlands, or Australia, as you might see in a little bit. On the other hand, you tend to find synchronic cultures in Southern Europe, South America, or in Asia. But I will leave Tom to explain in detail what synchronic and sequential cultures are. Based on the initial research of Edward Hall, it is very important to mention that sequential cultures are called monochronic and synchronic cultures are polychronic.
So again, going back to the work, it was based on the work of, again, Edward Hall, who talked about polychronic and monochronic time. So monochronic time is where time is linear. One leads to the other. So it's always about being on time. Whereas polychronic time is where time is life. It's about being in the present. So people who are coming from polychronic cultures tend to be far more loose with time. Far more loose. They don't get as stuck on time because time is very much a flowing instance. We joke about the time when if you were in Fiji, which is an island of Australia, Fiji, they talk about Fijian time. And if you're standing at a bus stop and the timetable says the bus is going to come at 10 o'clock and you wait there, it's 10, 10:30, 11, and you say, when is the bus coming? You'll find people will say, the bus will come when it comes. Right? Relax.
It is the same. I remember when I was in actually in South America, it wasn't that bad. But in Spain, when you come from like even UK, let's say West, like more Germany maybe, and then you go to Spain and like everybody is like the Spanish time. Yeah.
Correct. Spanish time, it's like, wow, because it's the siesta, it's much looser. And so people would argue that a lot of it has to do with the weather, it's warmer, etc. Yes, there's multiple theories on that. But it's also the value placed on it. So I was doing a webinar this evening with a group from India. And we were talking about developing cultural intelligence for emerging economies. And one of the things that we were discussing was the fact that Indians, as a rule, right? So, as a general rule, there's a term called Indian stretch time, because Indians, as a general rule, have a loose structure around time.
Yeah.
Right? They're not so tight on it. Meetings tend to be fluid. Timetables tend to be, so everybody understands that, right? But that is a stereotype that exists about Indians in other parts of the world. So if you're in India working with Indians, it's fine. But if you take that behavior and come, say, to a country like Australia, right? The meeting is supposed to be at 10 a.m. and you turn up at 10:15 or 10:30. Here already you are perceived now to be rude, unprofessional, right? Ignorant. And so already the meeting is starting on a bad footing, right?
You said weather might be one of the factors, and there could be others as well. Would you possibly give some example of what other factors may be influenced?
Well, I think weather definitely. I think there's something about heat. You find that most of the countries that tend to be more polychronic or looser with time tend to be warmer countries. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that you have times of the day where you just are not as, you have to relax, right? Like, think about siestas, right? The Spaniards have it. Some of the South American countries have it. A lot of the parts of Asia have it because it's hot, right? It's in the middle of the day. So therefore you tend to have a lot more activity early, or later.
Late.
Yeah. People would eat late, right? Go out for dinner at 10 p.m., right? We go like, what? There's in other parts of the world, that would be bedtime.
So next time you're a Brit traveling to Spain, an Australian visiting Fiji, or a German doing business in India, do expect people to look at you weirdly if you're what they would call too punctual, or if you can't wait to have dinner at 6 p.m. On the other hand, if you're from Latin America and you're 30 minutes late for an important meeting, don't expect those in charge to be too patient with you. At least not as much as they were during those 30 minutes. So the last classification is maybe the one that I was the most curious in out of the three, and the one that probably I was the most interested in Tom's opinion. That is effective versus neutral countries. The difference between the two is the way you show emotions while communicating, and effectively, if you even do it. So let's find out how we got from my cultural shock to Steve Jobs. This one is probably the one that I'm maybe the most interested in, because it also involves a bit of business. It also involves my personal cultural shock coming from Romania to UK and seeing how different emotions are expressed in those two cultures. So, yeah. What do you think?
What did you notice when you came from Romania to the UK? What did you notice?
The stereotypical thought, I would say, of Romanians and people from maybe South and Eastern Europe coming to UK and to the more Germanic cultures as Germany and the Northern countries as well, is that they are cold. They just say they are cold people. But that is very shallow. When you get into it a bit, obviously, you would hit this effective or neutral cultures. But now, for me personally, it was, I didn't understand why would they not express themselves.
Yeah. Well, I suppose that's one way to look at it. There would also be many cultures where to demonstrate emotion is seen as losing control, right? Like, so the idea is there's a higher value placed on being calm, having a calm demeanor, being able to express different points of view, in a calm way. So going back to the high context communication, how do I express it in a different way? Whereas in other cultures, the idea of communications is to be fully expressed. Use your hands, use your face. Use gestures to tell the stories, because that also engages the listener in different ways. So again, it's what is an accepted view of that particular culture. So cultures which have a higher, what I call a higher level of emotion, more emotive cultures, also tend to be far more expressive. Less emotive, less expressions.
But why? Because you hear this a lot in the Western cultures. Why do you think because at the end of the expressing emotion is seen as vulnerability and it's seen as weakness? Why would that happen?
Well, I think it's seen as weakness it's very contextual, right, Stefan? Mm-hmm. So if you think about in the past, and traditionally, we look at exposing, when we talk about vulnerability, as being a sign of weakness, because of, again, you think of that culture, whether it's much more masculine. Whereas if you look at the new ways of work, if you look at all the latest work, say, from the people like Brené Brown, who's written about vulnerability. You talk about leaders, good leaders demonstrating vulnerability, because in today's world, if you're leading any organization, any team, the reality is your team members probably know more than you, right? Like, it is not possible for you as a leader to be across everything. If you're running a global team, in multiple countries, how do you know what's happening on the ground in another part of the world, right? So you need to be able to demonstrate vulnerability. You need to be able to say, now, I think it's completely reasonable for leaders to say, actually, I don't know the response to that, right? I don't know the answer to that. How do we find out? Who do we need to talk to, right? Because you can find there's data, and there's information, and there's knowledge, right? So if you think of that as a hierarchy, there's loads of data around, there's lots of information around, or you can Google anything, right? But then it's like, what do I do with that information to make it into knowledge, right? Which is fine. But really the key is, how do I utilize that knowledge to create insights? Now, insights requires a level of experience. Insight requires wisdom. Insight requires pattern recognition. And sometimes you don't know when you're doing something, how it will come into play years later, right? Yeah. So if you think of the story of, Steve Jobs talks about the fact of when he went to college, he ended up being in a class doing a subject on calligraphy, right? Yeah, kind of know it wasn't part of, but he was kind of interested, he had an aesthetic flair about it. And many years later, when they were creating the fonts for the style for Apple, that's where it came into play, right? But who would have known that link?
Yeah, definitely.
So sometimes I think as human beings, we also need to embrace and embark on different journeys and think, well, what do I learn from it?
That, I guess, describes the best the spirit of us in the age of humans. And personally, I felt amazing that Tom took the path of simply expressing his excitement into learning something new. And that is because he inspires people around the world every day to learn to communicate more efficiently, as well as we are trying to inspire you to learn something new. In this instance, it's about culture and communication. So now that we know some ways to classify cultures, the next logical step is to find out the relationship between culture and communication. So are those two interdependent or independent?
Well, I don't think it's neither dependent nor interdependent on culture. I think if you don't have any form of communication, then what is culture, right? So it actually goes back to, how do you define culture, So if you define culture as the accepted norms, the accepted behaviors, our values, shared set of beliefs, if that is culture, then we need to have a way to communicate that, right? So going back to the original story of being in the cave and going to hunt for the buffalo, right? We would need a signal between us on the buffaloes coming this way or turning right or left or whatever. That inevitably becomes a code between us, right? Then you get a third person involved. We're going to explain that to the third person on this is the code. And the fourth, that becomes culture. That's how culture evolves, right? Culture is always evolving. It's not just a thing. Culture is very subjective. So what people try to do is we find people want to think about culture as being objective. Let me put a new number on it, right? Let me be numerical. They are on this score at this type of dimension. It's very subjective. It's based on your own upbringing. It's based on what's your data point, right? Because all of us have a culture that we grew up in. We tend to use that as our starting point, right? Our measure. So it's like when you said coming from, Romania through to the UK, there was different communication styles, right? You went, wow. But imagine if you were going from the UK through to Spain, right?
You'd freak out.
Like, man, what are these people doing? Right? It's like, I'm going to Italy. Like, it's like.
Yeah, you would freak out a bit, I guess.
Well, yeah, you freak out because you go, this is very abnormal. All right. And why it's only abnormal? Because it's not normal for you. It's not abnormal for the Italians, right? Because that's how they do it anyway.
Yeah, I guess it comes to like anything that is human oriented, it cannot be fully objective ever. So, yeah.
That's right. Yeah. That's always a level of bias, right? We all bring bias into any interaction. Yeah. Bias keeps us alive. It helps us navigate life. So therefore, we just need to be conscious that the challenge with it is we have biases which we are conscious of, and then we have biases which we are unconscious of. And those are the things that trip us up.
Do you agree that in order to understand other cultures and integrate, probably that would be the better word, to integrate into other cultures, do those beliefs and biases and shared values, do they have to be familiar and accepted in order to fully integrate?
I don't know whether they need to be accepted, but I think they need to be somehow appreciated, would be the word. So one of the things that in terms of developing any cross-cultural interaction and familiarity, so if you want to develop familiarity with someone of a different culture, exposure to that culture, makes it far easier, right? Because you then understand, you're in it, you're in the mix, right? Rather than looking at it from outside, you're actually in the mix. Now, as you would know, Stefan, it is possible for people to go from different countries, come into the UK and just stick within their own bubble.
Definitely.
Right? With people they have their own country, they speak their own language, et cetera, et cetera. Or, we have, for instance, many expats that I work with. They go to another country as an expat, but they just live in their bubble because they go to the office, they come back to their compound, they hang out with people in the compound who are their friends, but they don't interact with the locals. So they don't actually have the experience of the local. So therefore, it's possible to live in a culture and not experience local. But if you want to have greater interaction, greater understanding, you definitely want exposure to the other. Because the only reason we think of the other, which is separate to me, is because I don't understand the other, right? So how do I get to understand the other? That's always a big challenge in any form of cross-culture work.
Regardless of the connection between culture and communication, one cannot form an opinion unless exposing themselves to as many cultures as they can. Cultural exposure is definitely something we recommend here at the Age of Humans. If you're lucky enough to come from a multicultural, multi-ethnic country, then you have no excuse not to fight ignorance, so talk to your friends, ask them about your cultural differences, be curious, because you only have to win from this kind of deal. Not only new knowledge and new perspectives, but it will unite you. On the other hand, if your country is not very mixed, then we suggest you go online, research, go on tandems online as well, talk to others, or maybe buy a plane ticket after the pandemic. Now, for the next part, you may hear mentioned a few times the term lingua franca. It basically means that if I come from Romania and I speak Romanian and English, and you come from Germany and you speak German and English, then our lingua franca is English, because it is a foreign language that helps us understand each other. We will cover this topic in depth in the next episode, so stay tuned. Well, communication would be a problem when you marginalize yourself and your culture, obviously, when you join, like coming to Australia, to UK. But would you say it's helpful, subjectively speaking, to broaden this communication, like your communication skills? It doesn't matter if it is a lingua franca, as it is English in this case, or it is your own language. But do you think, from personal point of view, your values and your experiences as a person, how is it influenced when you, like, what develops when you try to integrate, when you actually take the step?
I think what it does is, in many instances, what you then try to do is develop your capacity to be able to explain and understand things in a greater context. Because sometimes what language does is it limits you, right? So, for instance, I remember working with a leader who told me about his time. He was American, going to Germany when he was a young engineer. And he said, one of the key learnings he received on that early trip was a realization that it's really difficult to come across as being smart and know what you're talking about when you do not have command of the language, right? He couldn't explain things in German, right? He had basic German knowledge, but he couldn't explain the scientific engineering terms. And he said, I knew the responses, but I couldn't explain it, right? So you look stupid, right? Because you're not that smart, okay? And you find that in many multinationals which are working across cultures, that's one of the challenges. It's like, what is the lingua franca? And then we tend to judge people on that. Right? We tend to judge people on what's your language capacity, because language is the key that transmits ideas.
But don't you think that some cultures are more tolerant than others in terms of how smart you look?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. But it depends on what industry you're in, right? Like in some industries, it doesn't matter, right? It may be your creativity, or it may be your musical skill set, or it may be the fact that you're a great chef. So you're actually communicating through other means. But if you need language to communicate, so we're going back here to language, you need to be able to have command of the words, because otherwise, when you try to explain something that you are familiar with in a different language, it's extremely hard because you don't have the nuances. The softer skill. I mean, you live in the UK, right? You know that English is one of the most difficult languages to learn, right? The understatement of the English, right? The humor of the English. When sometimes you're outside, when you're not from the UK or not from England, you listen to some of the way language is used. It's a command of the language that is very difficult.
Language mastery or proficiency is something that many people tried to measure throughout different exams and assigning you marks based on how well you perform in those tests. Most of us probably heard about Cambridge, IELTS, or TOEFL for English, or DEL for DAL for French. There are several others for Italian, Japanese, Russian, and so on. Important languages of this world that tried to evaluate their speakers in order to see if they are capable to use their language skills in a work environment. Skills like speaking, writing, listening, or reading. Skills that, as we have heard from Tom, they may or may not be relevant to communicate how good you are in a profession, even if you decide to change the country. But is sense of humor relevant?
Well, I think, in terms of sense of humor, I like the story of, there was this Western executive who was traveling in Japan, and he was doing the standard, doing the 3 presentations a day to his organization. He was using a translator. So as was the normal style, he started with some humor, tell a joke, couple of jokes, get people laughing. So on his first day, he had a translator. He did his presentation, told the jokes, everybody laughed. On the second day, he was in another town, a different translator. He did the same presentation, same jokes. Nobody laughed, right? Day 3, he's back in the other town again. Same translator from day 1, tells the jokes, makes the presentation. Everybody laughs. He goes, yes, I'm back. I can do it. But then at the back of his mind, he had a sneaking suspicion. He said, I better check my assumptions. So he asked her, say, excuse me, I want to know when I tell the presentation, the jokes here, people laugh. But yesterday, the interpreter, they couldn't say the jokes in such a way. And she said to him, sir, I tell the audience, the gentleman has just made a joke. Please laugh. So, Stefan, the key is jokes, right, are very difficult to translate across cultures and language because jokes are very much culture bound, right? So what I always talk to my clients about is having a sense of humor. So a sense of humor means you can look for the things that's funny around the place. And most times, always better if you can make a sense or joke about yourself, right? Self-deprecating rather, because you find if you look at the structure of jokes, usually the structure of jokes is always at the expense of the other.
Yeah.
It's what happened to the other. So you joke, you laugh because of somebody else's misfortune.
This is really interesting because in probably Eastern European countries, self-deprecation is really seen. It's more of a taboo. Or
yeah. Yes, very difficult. Very difficult. And it's the same in the United States, right? So if you came from, with a lot of people